I like to think of myself as a lenient person. I want to give developers the benefit of the doubt, but I will not lie to you. Forspoken, even on a deep, deep sale, is a game that should be passed over primarily because of how generic it is. To me, this is Square Enix's biggest miss because there were so many different opportunities to take a game, especially a new IP, and hit the ground running, and instead, you are just hit with so many different exposition dumps. You have so many moments that are ruined by poor dialogue and even poor delivery. This is one of those games that you can just file away right now because unless it comes out on PlayStation Plus or somehow it becomes a free Epic title, I do not recommend picking up this game. But I do want to talk about where it went wrong and how they could have been better. To kick things off, I really want to talk about the first few hours of this game, and I believe that these are some of the roughest I've ever played, especially when you consider that, it's a AAA studio. I think there's like this really deep writing pedigree. I know Gary Whitta was a writer on this, and I have to ask myself, why the fuck were the developers so invested about force feeding you information during the first few hours of this game? And why did they cut you off so many times, especially when you were starting to get into a flow? I never understood it, because it takes like 40 minutes to actually get to Athia, which is the new world. And then when you get to Athia, you have to sit there and you get the opportunity to ask the cuff like 10 questions, which makes no sense to me because the cuff can talk to you non-goddamn stop about some bullshit that just doesn't interest you. And then when you get past that point, you fight your first couple of enemies, you fight your first couple of bosses, the game's like cutscene time. And usually I'm okay with learning about the world, especially if it's new, but like this is just like Metal Gear Solid levels of bullshit, but just not as interesting. Because here's the deal. When I'm being interrupted constantly when I'm trying to get into the flow, I just lose interest. And then I start skipping dialogue and I start skipping cutscenes. And that happened a lot here. Because even when you were getting into these moments, you're thinking to yourself, okay, cool, I'm out into the world, I get this small chunk of gameplay, I get to see what Forspoken is all about. And then they're like, cutscene, exposition dump, sit in this room, and I want you to learn about this world. I want you to know who all these characters are. I want you to know who the Tantas are and what their importance is, and I'm going to ram that down your throat. And I'm like, holy shit, dude, it's been 2 hours. I have one ability. When do I get my second one? And that's essentially a process that they just constantly push into you. Because here's the thing. When you first get out into the world and you get to fight that first major boss, I think they do a good job of pretty much going like, there's multiple checkpoints because you are going miles down the road. When you get past these first checkpoints, you finally get to that castle, which I thought was pretty cool when you finally got there. And they give you this split path option of how you want to approach it. You fight that first mid-boss. You get through those double doors. And then you're like, yes. Now I'm 4 hours in, but I'm going to fight this first major boss. And I'm pretty excited. But there's a long hallway full of different paintings. And for some reason, you're going to have to stop and literally learn about all these different characters. Holy shit. We're losing me here. Like, can we get it going? So you fight the first major boss, which by the way, I thought was a pretty good boss fight. It just so happens to be the best boss fight in the game. But then you end up being this boss, get some minor exposition here and there. You get phrase feelings on it, which by the way, really contradict how she talks for most of the game up until that point. Then you have to go back to the city. You're hailed as a hero. Everyone's like, yeah, welcome back, kick ass. And then you have to literally talk to all these different NPCs to progress the story. And by the way, those NPCs don't tell you shit. It's just random conversations. And then that is how the game treats you for the first 4 to 6 hours. You feel stupid. You do. Because they're constantly holding your hand. And the other thing is, it's a major red flag when in the opening hours of the game, when they start showing you the different dungeons, that the first few dungeons are pretty much all the same. Because then it goes into your head where you're like, holy shit, is this how all of them are going to be? And yes, that's how it is. The opening hours are rough. and they do very little to capture your attention. And to me, that right there is just one of the biggest problems from the jump with Forspoken. Just a massive sin. So the next big miss, in my opinion, is the narrative. And I just want to kind of lump the characters into this too, because I do not know how they came up with something so generic and predictable, knowing that they had this incredibly talented writing room that wrote this game. Seriously, if you look it up, you're going to see some veterans of, video games, movies, books, TV shows, comics, all that stuff. And you're probably going to sit there and ask yourself, how did you guys come up with Forspoken? Why is this like every other fantasy RPG? There's this cursed land. You have these fallen heroes. They went mad. Now they're tyrants and you have to take them down. You have this character who you're going to learn their connection to the actual area that they're in right now, like Athia. It's like they weren't just summoned randomly. Obviously, they were born there. Obviously, they have a connection to these characters. You can see it from the first boss you fight. You're like, okay, sure, I can handle that. And then you get to that final villain reveal, and I go, my goodness. So the Cuff gets revealed to be the final villain. And listen, it sounds ridiculous, but it actually makes sense because the Cuff was essentially a demon that had to be sealed by the Tantas. They broke it into 4 pieces, and those 4 pieces eventually made the Tantas go mad. I actually thought it was pretty good, but here's the problem. At no point in time does the final villain ever come off as malicious at any point during the time Cuff and Frey are together. And it bothered me because you could have had this really big, impactful moment, but because Frey did not give a shit for 90% of the game, you essentially have a moment that falls flat. And you really could have nailed it here. This could have been a really big moment. And for some reason, it falls flat because of Frey. I don't know how we got here, but it shouldn't have been like this. This should have been an open and shut case. This should have been a slam dunk. This should have been super easy to pull off, and they didn't do it right. I don't understand it. And by the way, I just want to say that practically every character in this game is forgettable. And the one character that you're supposed to root for and back the entire time is Frey, and she is damn near unlikable. And I mean that. That's how they wrote her. She's the reluctant hero, but she practically shows no growth. And the best part about it, I swear, is that she is constantly talking about how she hates being there, how she wants to go home, how she doesn't want to do this. And then you have the Cuff who's trying to build her up as a hero, saying this is your fate, you got to do this, you got to be the good guy, you got to be the hero. And she's constantly pushing against it, begrudgingly doing the right thing as if it's going to kill her, which, more than likely it would have, but holy shit, show some growth. You don't show any with Frey throughout the entire game until you get to the end. Until they have this massive exposition dump, which, by the way, was incredibly frustrating to sit through. That right there pissed me off. That set me off near the end because you pretty much lose your powers. Then you have to sit through this mass exposition dump to get her powers back. And then you're sitting there going, now I have to learn about all of this stuff, the events of the game, the events about why everything happened, just before I get to the end. That is bad writing. And Frey is still unlikable up until that point. And then you get a choice. You literally get a choice to go back to New York to your cat or to fight the final boss. And Frey's like, I can't just let it stand because I chose to fight the final boss. I could have just left. It's just bad writing. Like, you could choose to end the game because the game was just at that point frustrating to play. That's how the narrative worked in this game. It was uninspired, it was bland, it was boring, and you had characters that you just didn't care about. Like, they even tried to do this like really cheap thing where they tried to kill a small child in front of you and they're like, don't you feel bad? You talked to that kid Olivia for like 30 minutes, barely got to know him, and they killed her off. I'm like, dude, I had no emotional connection to that child. That is a cheap move, and it did not work. How the hell, with all of those veteran writers, did you come up with this? It's just poorly done all around. So the final big miss of Forspoken is going to be the open world, and it's primarily because I really feel like what's here just isn't interesting enough for you to kind of go out and want to explore. Now, while I think the vistas are different and they do a good job of differentiating themselves, there are some really cool structures you're going to find. What the game does is that once you explore a tower, pretty much if you just roam around an area, you're going to see that each of these areas have indicators to detail what's there. Now, while I appreciate the developers for going out of their way and pretty much telling the players that, hey, here's what's here, so you don't have to waste your time wondering, the thing is, it ruins any sense of organic exploration, which should be something you look forward to in an open world. Like, I want to be able to roam around and find things where I can be like, oh shit, what's this? This might actually yield some good treasure. For the most part, it doesn't. It's just resources for small upgrades that probably won't matter to you by the time you get to the end of the game. But for the most part, there is no organic exploration in this game. You're literally finding everything on the map and then going, I do need a new cape, or you know what? I do need a new necklace, that type of stuff. That to me is incredibly frustrating. I could not believe that the developers just kind of went out of their way to identify where things were for you. So it kind of ruined the surprise. So instead, you're just like, well, I guess I'll just make my way from point A to point B and just move on. Because you totally can. You can totally skip out on a bunch of stuff here because most of it probably won't matter to you. And if you want, you can just like pop open your map and be like, where is the thing that's going to really help with my magic or my defense? Okay, there it is. Let's go there really quickly. The other thing that really frustrated me is that it's pretty barren. And by that I mean the first two regions, you really got to look for fights. Combat is the best thing in this game. It really is. Once you get your second to third abilities, I really feel like the combat opens up. But the thing is, in these two regions, you really can't find most enemies because there's not really random encounters. They're kind of in set areas and you just have to go to that place. Because I expected to kind of be interrupted and, be intercepted by flying enemies or massive bear, all that type of stuff, like these random cool encounters, and that did not happen. That to me kind of weirded me out. I was like, so where are all the enemies? And it wasn't until you got to the third region in which you actually saw an abundance of enemies to fight. But by that time frame, you're probably, looking to just complete the story because, listen, if I have to get to the end of the game where I'm barely fighting enemies in the open field, like I'm not just going to start looking for fights now. I'm looking to end the game. That's essentially what it is. And the open world just really disappointed me in that way. I was really hoping for something that was dynamic and something engaging, and you don't get that in the slightest. You have like areas where it gets pointed out, like maybe you should explore here. There's like a little bit of narrative going here. And then you'll go there. It's like small area, you get attacked, you fight some enemies off, and then Frey and, the Cuff have a conversation. That's pretty much it. It's kind of sad. It's probably one of the things that I think they really missed on because, it's a fantasy epic. Do something crazy. Throw these massive dragons, golems, all these different animals that we don't know about because this world is not Earth. The complete opposite. And instead, when you get to a new region, you know how you identify it? By the different color-coded markings. Red, green, blue, purple. That's it. That's how this game works. It's incredibly frustrating. Now that we've identified the major misses for Forspoken, I do want to talk about the solutions, and I do feel like two of them are really obvious. For starters, I really feel like the opening session in New York could have been a cutscene. 5 to 10 minutes, however long they wanted to make it. And then from there, when you got to Athia, then you let the player play. You let them learn about the world. You have maybe one exposition dump, but you do it in an interesting manner by talking to important characters. And then you have her go out in the world. You could have had the Cuff and her have meaningful conversations, although they didn't do that for whatever reason. But you could have had them had meaningful conversations as they were progressing through the world. And that to me would have been really interesting. All the developers had to do was just ease on the hand-holding and limit the interruptions. And I think the opening would have been really solid and it would have been really fluid. Instead, they killed the pace and honestly elongated the game. Now, when it comes to the plot, I think that if they went for less cheap shock value type stuff and really try to make impactful choices with some of the characters, like let you care about them first instead of killing them super quick, I think you would have probably had far greater impact in those areas. And also, just throwing this out there, make Frey less indifferent. Her indifference throughout the entirety of the plot was insane to me, because it's like she refused to grow, and until you got to the end of the game where all these revelations were being dumped upon you, that's when essentially Frey had to grow. But it was more like this weird choice of you either go here or you go here. And if you go here, you're going to grow, but if you don't go here, you are not going to grow. And that to me was maddening. To save that big decision until the end, to have this character just kind of not give a shit, really impacted my ability to care. Because if the main character doesn't care, why should I? So when it comes to fixing the open world, I really feel like there's a couple things you could do. One, more random encounters, more elite enemies, more field bosses, that type of stuff. And not just those like in set areas. I'm talking like when I'm roaming around and I'll just run into certain enemies or I'll be ambushed, that type of stuff. Those things would have been a lot of fun. I enjoy the fact that in certain regions you would see enemies fighting each other. That's great. But I also want to have enemies ambush you, because I think that would have been really interesting given the circumstances of certain parts of the game. The other thing is, I'm cool with you identifying rewards for certain areas. That's completely fine. I really think that those should only stick for the robes and the necklaces. That's it. Nothing else. Every other point of interest really needs to randomize the rewards so it incentivizes exploration by the player. You made this open world for a reason. Make it interesting. I do not understand why they tried to hold the hand of the player so hard in the open world, where it got to the point where I was like, I don't need that. I don't need that. I don't need to see it. I'm just going to keep moving. Don't do that. Don't kill your own game. It makes no sense. While there are other reasons as to why Forspoken failed, I really think the three big misses I identified in this video were the most pronounced. The opening hours of any game should not be this tedious, should not be this boring, should not have this much interference. You just can't do it to the player. You cannot actively push players away from your game. It just doesn't make any sense. The writing in this game is underwhelming, which is shocking given the talent. You'd expect something that would be grandiose or at least good, and instead you get something subpar and underdeveloped. And when it comes to the open world, I mean, you're just stacking shit on top of a shit sandwich, and this is what you get. Unfortunately, Forspoken is going to go down as probably Square Enix's biggest miss, and I cannot understand for the life of me why anyone thought this was an acceptable product, given the fact that it was promoted so hard and it just fell flat. And like I mentioned in the intro, I'm a pretty lenient person when it comes to games. I like to give game developers the benefit of the doubt, and I think that most games can overcome a poor opening. A lot of RPGs do. See almost every game in the Tale series. But when it comes to Forspoken, it cannot overcome this many issues, and on top of that, have a really poor opening. And if I'm Sony and Square Enix, I'm not bringing up Forspoken anymore. I'm just moving on about my day. Let's get on to the next project, and hopefully we can move on past this mess. And that is going to do it for this video. If you happen to like the content, please consider like, sharing, and subscribing. I'm Ken from Pixelated Thoughts, and I'll talk to you next time.
Your protector is fallen. So, how do you fancy your chances on your own? You gonna put up a fight?
I warned you to be careful what you wish for.
Who do you think you are?
I'm Tanta Frey, daughter of Sinta, protector of Assia.